Yeah, so it's hard for me to really pinpoint a specific project. I think there's a lot of things that my team has worked on that I'm pretty proud of. I think the first thing that comes to mind is just building out the team, and I think we've done a really good job at that. I think two features that we've been working on recently, not myself personally, but we released a really great live feature for our hockey product, Ice, which was a really, I think, cool experience overall. I think it was the first time we tried a bunch of new things in the product, and we're in the process of kind of evaluating how that's going. Another thing is our player profiles and our soccer product pitch, which is all around using templates to understand how different players play and how they compare to the rest of the leagues that they play in, or the rest of the players in the leagues that they play in. So those are probably some of the things I'm most proud of that has been produced by our team. Thanks for the question, Ellie. I think it's really common that people without product design backgrounds can transition into product design roles. There's, I think, a couple things that are really specific to doing product design work that it's more around mindset as opposed to skill that allows people to succeed in that type of environment. It really comes down, I think, to an environmental thing. So product work is super longitudinal. It's really about taking a long-term approach. It's about understanding how you iterate, how you experiment, and it's less so about kind of a final mock-up. So the ability to collaborate well, because the success of a design on a product team really comes down to what ends up within the product, and so it needs to be a collaborative effort between stakeholders, developers, and product managers. So I mean, it's a bit more of a personality trait, but that's definitely one. Any experience in a product environment, I think, would help. So if they've been a product manager, if they've been a support person that's been adjacent to a product team, things like that are always a plus. And as much as possible, people with still relatively good production skills are going to be relied on quite a bit within the implementation stage in terms of being able to provide guidelines for developers. There's a lot of other things. I think people that have done UX work in an iterative environment, and then people that have done research work in a startup environment, things like that bode pretty well as well. But overall, it's kind of, there's so many things that make a good product designer, and so someone that has a couple of those important attributes around flexibility, around the ability to work within that environment, and obviously good design chops, good UI chops, and preferably a good understanding of user-centered design and those processes. All right, thanks for the question, Ellie. So in terms of building out experiences that at the core part of the experience is the user navigating and understanding and reading data. I think the challenge is always data can be really granular. You can build really flexible experiences that provide users a lot of options, and you pretty much end up building kind of a spreadsheet of sorts. And the other side of the spectrum is building products that are extremely focused and don't provide users a lot of flexibility, but if you have a really clear understanding of the insights the users are looking for, you can really drive them to those really quickly. I think the biggest challenge is always kind of figuring out that balance for different types of users. Different teams with different levels of maturity around data, and the different users within them will have different needs around that. And so I think that is something that we're always kind of trying to balance and make sure we understand clearly who we're building different features for, because in certain cases, providing flexibility to a user will mean that it's too much data for them to navigate. On the flip side, not providing someone that actually really understands how to read data with enough flexibility for them to really answer the questions they want answered can really make the product completely unusable for them, right? So figuring out that balance, being really intentional about who different features are being designed for, that's definitely a huge challenge, I think, for us, and I think it's something that we still are figuring out, working on, refining as we move ahead. I would say that's probably the biggest challenge. Thanks for the question, Matt. I think that's a really interesting question. It's hard to answer without like knowing all the context. It's always really important to, I think, understand what role the data plays in the user's journey and what questions you want the data to answer for the user. In this case, in the case of tracking progress, this is definitely kind of probably a behavior that you're trying to build in with the user. So trying to understand the role the data plays throughout the journey is, I think, really, really important. I think if you start at, what do you want to accomplish with the data, you kind of work backwards, whether it's designing data viz or features or flows that bring people to the data. I think that'll give you kind of your guiding light or your kind of benchmark in terms of how people should be using or consuming that data. For something like that, I would say the best thing to do is to really build stuff and test it and understand what people actually need. And if you can, talk to users before you even start building out the app, or talk to people that you think would be target users. It's tracking progress on training or working out is very much a longitudinal experience that you're providing for users. So trying out research methods like diary studies, or seeing how people use similar apps at the moment can be really helpful for understanding, what is that, not just that, couple of screens experience, but what does that repetitive experience look like, over weeks and months of tracking your progress. But building that empathy, understanding why people want to see that data, what makes them click, what makes them want to come back, if that's the ultimate goal. I think that is the best way to go about making design decisions around that. And then be really mindful. I think it's great to make data fun and look good, but always balance that out with legibility and practicality. Is this actually something that is useful for users, or does it, just look pretty for the sake of looking pretty? I think good products do a really good job at balancing kind of joy and ease of use with giving people exactly what they need when they want it. Yeah. Good luck with building your app. Hey Julian, thanks for the question. It's a really good question. I think as a team, we face a lot of really similar struggles. I think there's a spectrum in what we can provide to users that ranges from being just kind of pretty much a interactive data set that we provide the kind of surrounding filters and settings for people to navigate that, to I think creating really kind of really starting at what the insight is, and then kind of working backwards to design experiences that bring users to that insight. I think in our case, we're working with a lot of teams, and that's certainly a challenge in that different teams and different people on teams and different levels of maturity in terms of data literacy definitely creates a range of needs. So there are teams that prefer being on one end of the spectrum versus another. I think with all data products, there's always a bit of that struggle, and I think really understanding what your kind of end user needs is always really, really important to make those decisions. And I think in this case, it sounds like you do have that understanding of who's reading it. And so one thing that I think I'm actually kind of borrowing this from a lot of the teams we talk to and a lot of the analysts that work within sports teams. And I think we try to recreate this is, the first touch point with providing analytics and data to, let's say, a coach on a team or to a scout is all around building trust, and often they do that by, at the very least, providing the answers that they need. The next level is, I think, building out data sets and metrics that really speak the language of people within teams, and creating that shared kind of language that, a coach can look at a metric and say, like, yeah, I understand what that means tangibly based on, how I analyze a game on a qualitative level myself when I watch a game. And that what it does is it builds trust over time. And I think what I've heard from a lot of analysts on teams is that over time they use that trust to kind of widen the gap of the amount of data or the amount of things that they feel they can bring that maybe the coach isn't asking for directly, but that the analysts think is valuable. So over time they build that pull in their organization. I think we try to build out our products in a similar way, in that we make sure we meet the needs, the core needs and the core requests, and then I think we also try to expand their kind of viewport into seeing also what we think is important about the game. And it's always a bit of a balance, right? If we just force what we think is important, or if we want to provide too much data for them to kind of understand the argument we're making, I think we'll always throw people off, right? I think a big part of that is understanding that, you know, the moments that people analyze data are really, really small moments in kind of a broader kind of life that people are living, right? So in the case of a coach, they're doing hundreds of different things, and data comes into play in these small little bits. So to expect them to have the attention span, or to have the really just like the bandwidth to consume that effectively in the way that we want them to, I don't think is reasonable. So we always have to be mindful of the broader context that they're consuming data in. There's always a benefit of doing things interactively, right? So you can start with an insight and provide layers behind insights that allow people to dig deeper if they want to. And then there's the flip side. There's creating kind of interactive experiences that start with broad data sets, but funnel people down into the specific insight that we think is important. The way you get people to understand your reports is by speaking their language and kind of making sure you have a really strong line of communication with those people. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but generally, like, that's how we think about those things. But it's certainly a challenge. You're not alone. I think most people that use data to tell people things, I think it's really easy to make an argument to ourselves that makes sense. I think figuring out how we get buy-in from other people and we make that argument in a way that's convincing to people that haven't spent as much time in the data, that's a whole other challenge around communication and visualization. And in our case, it's interactive experiences that we build to make sure that we can kind of either help people come to their own conclusions, or bring people in on the conclusions that we make. Thanks for the question. I think one challenge that I think it's recent, and that is something we constantly come across, is just bringing that user-centered design process that we use to figure out interactions and flows and even kind of visual patterns into data viz. It's something that I think is like a really unique skill set that I think we're starting to build out a little bit internally within our team, but it's really hard to do. It's really hard to catch up to where like sports data analytics is. So it's something that we're constantly working on. Sports data viz is kind of such a, in a lot of ways, I find it's really ahead. There's so many hobbyists that love playing around with sports data that, do stuff on Tableau and put it up on Twitter, and building out that same intuition on our design team is definitely not the easiest thing in the world, and it's something that I think we all kind of push each other to do more of. Another challenge I think is I think navigating the data and building logical taxonomies around it and different features. We have so much data and it goes so deep in so many different directions. So building out taxonomies that feel logical to users and make sense can be, besides the usual challenges of really understanding intent really clearly and understanding legibility and recognition over recall, the huge amount of labels and terms that we need to navigate to make sure that things make sense are always a challenge. Okay, well, thanks for that question, guys. There's actually an ongoing joke in the office that I shop at Frank & Oak a lot because we are actually right next to one of their stores. So I do that a lot. I think some product designers dress well and some don't. I don't think it really matters. In the end, it's what goes up on the screen, and so much of product design isn't aesthetic, right? So much of product design is about it's a lot more logical than that. So I would never judge a product designer on the way they dress.